Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Thank you so much for joining me. Got a very special episode for you guys today. I call this one, Mother and Son on Board a UFO. This is the true story of Inus Simon and her 7-year-old son Richard, who shared an onboard UFO encounter. It's a truly compelling multiple witness case, very poignant. It is filled with all kinds of details, and I think it provides some really interesting insights into what it's like to have an onboard UFO encounter. This case was taken from my book, Humanoids and High Strangeness. I gave it the first chapter because I think it's really one of the most compelling stories in the book. Super interesting. It's quite a long series of events, so I've shortened it here for this video. So please don't think this is fully comprehensive. You can read the whole story in my book, but man oh man, of all the people I've interviewed, this mother and son really touched my heart. Their case is so amazing. It's such an honor to have spoken with them, and I'm really glad that they agreed to allow their story to be shared with a wider audience. Now, contact often starts at a very early age, and that's certainly true for Richard. He was only, again, 7 years old when his encounter began, but it was completely shrouded in amnesia. He was not aware of it at all. The only clue was a sudden onset of insomnia. So this is how it all began for him. It was 1974, and Richard was only 7 years old when his life changed forever. At the time, they lived in Cleveland, Ohio, and one evening, seemingly overnight, Richard began to suffer from severe insomnia. There was no warning, no reason that he could understand. He just suddenly had trouble sleeping. Now, along with this came a strange fear of intruders and being watched. His mom soon noticed that her son was tired and listless throughout the day, and she asked him what was wrong, but Richard had no answers. When night came, he would become anxious and could not sleep. He would always check the windows and doors, made sure they're locked, but nothing seemed to help, and he learned to just live with it by taking naps during the day. But that same year, he did suddenly become interested in science fiction, technology, space exploration. He had aspirations to become an inventor. In fact, he even put together a little radio device and told his parents he was trying to communicate with people on the moon. So this does seem to be related. As he grew into his teens, he began making complex, accurate blueprints and designs of various machines. He did very well in school. Later, as an adult, he became employed as a private investigator and then a customs service specialist, but ultimately became self-employed, creating professionally built models for private clients. I think this is probably all related, to some extent at least, to his childhood experience. But yeah, suffered from insomnia for years. Throughout his childhood and into adulthood, his insomnia troubles continued. At one point, he became a heavy cigarette smoker, but never did drugs or alcohol. So as you can see, his encounter completely slipped his conscious mind. He had no idea, neither did his mother. They just went on with their lives normally. But there were, of course, very strong clues beyond just the insomnia. Richard's personality changed quite a bit. He developed all these interests in things like astronomy and science fiction and inventions and electronics and so forth. But without any other clue as to what had happened to him to cause this insomnia, he just went on with his life. For a lot of contactees, this is how it rolls out. They're not always aware right off the bat that they're a contactee, and it may take a series of events to really bring this information to their conscious mind. But as a young man, he did have another amazing encounter, which certainly provided a clue that he was a contactee. And this one involved a really obvious and dramatic incident of missing time when he went out with his best friend to go fishing not far from their home on the shores of Lake Erie. It was one night At around 9 p.m., he believes in May of 1988 that Richard, now 21 years old, and his friend Zach, that's a pseudonym, they both set off to the shores of Lake Erie to do some night fishing. This is something they've done many times. It was just a short 20-minute walk to the shoreline, about a mile or two away from Burke Lakefront Airport. So they arrived, they walked over a short hill just before reaching their fishing destination, the shoreline of Lakefront Park, and this is when they both began to feel very strange. Coming over this hill, they felt as if they were moving in slow motion, almost as if there was some sort of weird force field. Both remarked on the strangeness of it, but continued walking the short distance to the beach, and this is when they immediately noticed something else. Everything was eerily quiet. There was no traffic noise, no sounds of waves, no bugs, just silence. This is what researchers call the Oz effect, and it was definitely going on with Richard and his friend Zach. Also strange is usually there were other people at this location, but this time, nobody. So this was very strange, and they talked about the weirdness of this, but again, didn't know what to make of it. So after fishing for about an hour, they noticed a goldish red ball of light hovering in the distance over the lake. They both instantly knew that this was strange. They'd been to this location many times and never saw anything like this. Neither could identify it, and they became even more curious and puzzled when this light, this object, began to move towards them. It then made a sharp 90-degree turn and zoomed straight up into the clouds at high speed and was gone. It took them a second to process this, but both soon realized that they had probably just seen a genuine UFO. It was just moments after this when a small Coast Guard boat approached the shoreline, and an officer who was on board used a bullhorn and asked Richard and Zach if they had seen any flares or strange lights and where had it come from. So Richard shouted out and pointed to the direction where they first saw this light, and before he could provide any other information, the Coast Guard boat moved off. So Richard and his friend became silent and just pensive, thinking about what had happened, when 20 minutes later, there was a repeat performance. Another gold-red orb appeared, moved closer, and just like the first one, darted upwards and was gone. Both were totally amazed. As Richard says, "We didn't know what to think or do." So they just sat there in stunned silence. And this is when Richard glanced at his watch. And he was shocked. His watch showed that it was already past 2 a.m., hours later than he thought it was. He told Zach, who didn't believe him actually, until he looked at his own watch. So both men were amazed. They couldn't believe 4.5 hours had gone by that quickly. At this point, everything was still eerily quiet. But they didn't know what to think of it. They stayed until around sunup and then began walking back again. Now, as they walked over this same hill where they had felt that weird force field, they once again felt this. They said it was kind of like moving through water, but of course no water was there. They felt like they were moving in slow motion. And they popped out the other side. This really made Richard quite curious, so he went back to try and investigate. But as he did so, this strange, weird heaviness just seemed to lift and dissipate, as if a switch had been flipped. And immediately all the normal night sounds and traffic noises appeared. They returned home and told Richard's mother, Inus. She didn't make much of it, but the next day, both were vindicated when Richard found a newspaper where the Coast Guard talked about seeing strange lights in the area. Both men agreed it had been a very weird night, but honestly didn't know what to make of it. Incredibly interesting. Both Richard and Zach knew that something very unusual had occurred, but not really knowing much about missing time and what that meant, they weren't really connecting the dots, but certainly got confirmation when they saw newspapers talking about sightings over Lake Erie on the night of their own encounter. So that's absolutely incredible confirmation. But it wasn't long after that through a series of synchronistic, kind of lucky events, Richard was able to recall what happened to him all those years ago at age 7 and finally learned the reason for his severe insomnia and anxiety. It was 1991, just a few years after Richard's missing time encounter, when his mother Inus announced that she wanted to quit smoking cigarettes and had found a hypnotherapist by the name of Retha Martin. And Inus wanted to visit Retha and use hypnotherapy to help her quit smoking. So she told her son Richard and said that he should also book an appointment and get some treatment for his insomnia. Richard wasn't thrilled with the idea. He resisted, but his mother insisted, and then she offered to pay for the session, so Richard finally agreed, and Inus booked back-to-back appointments with Retha for them both. They went together to Retha's office. Inus went in first while Richard remained in the waiting room, and as he was flipping through a magazine, he became concerned when he heard the muffled sounds of his mother weeping through the walls. About an hour later, she emerged from the office, teary-eyed. Richard jumped up and asked what happened. Neither his mother nor the doctor, Retha, would say anything. They told him that they would talk later, after his appointment. And Inus urged Richard to just go and speak with Retha. So Richard left his mother in the waiting room and sat down with Retha, who proceeded to ask him a series of questions about his childhood, life at home, and what he thought might have caused his insomnia. Richard explained that his childhood was normal and happy, that there was no apparent cause for this. Just one night he stopped sleeping well and felt compelled to check the windows and doors to make sure they were locked, that there were no intruders in the house. So after asking him all these questions, Retha said, "Well, let's try hypnosis." She explained the process to him and then placed Richard in a hypnotic trance. And she just asked the same questions. What did he think was the cause of his anxiety? And without warning, Richard says, he started to see these bright flashes of light, followed immediately by images of alien-like faces looking down at him as he lay on a metal table. Tears were forming in his eyes, and he shouted out, "They don't look human." There is, of course, a lot of controversy and discussion about the reliability of hypnotic regression, particularly when it comes to missing time and UFOs. But what I like about Richard and Inus's case is that they did not go to this hypnotist specifically to recall a UFO incident. This was the farthest thing from their minds, and yet these details came out without any prompting, without any leading from the hypnotist. And I think that is an important fact. And what's also super interesting is that they remembered this encounter in great detail. They absolutely remembered the full story. And not only that, their recall corroborated each other's stories. So this is really good evidence that hypnosis, used properly, does work. And Richard absolutely recalled being taken on board a UFO with his mother. So here's what Richard remembered. This is how his encounter started. He was 7 years old, he had gone to bed, and sometime in the middle of the night he woke up. Pitch blackness surrounded him. He thought, that's weird. All the lights in the house were off, but normally his parents left the bathroom light on and a small lamp in the living room on, but both had been switched off. So the house was in complete darkness, except for a weird, eerie, white-blue light coming from outside the front of the house. And he's wondering, is there a fire? Is there a car accident outside? What is going on? He exited his bedroom and crept around the house. He went into his parents' room. His dad, he knew, was at work, but his mom should be there. But she wasn't. The bed was empty. He called for her, but got no response. He checked under the bed, looked around the room. She was not there. Now his brother had moved out earlier, his older brother, so he crept towards his room, which faced the front of the house, and he could now see this light streaming in through the window. And through the window he saw this silhouette of a thin, short figure outside, walking outside. This scared him bad. He fled the room, went to the staircase, walked halfway up, still shouting for his mother, wondering if she's upstairs. But he was freaking out. There was still no response. His fear began to grow, so he turned around and was creeping down the stairs when suddenly the double front doors of the house flung open. He could now see this brilliant blue-white light flooding into the house, and standing there in the doorway was a very short, thin figure with a large oval head. It clearly was not human. And then, with no idea how he got there, Richard suddenly found himself lying on this cold metallic table, unable to move, surrounded by what he described as alien-looking figures. Remember, Richard was just 7 years old. He hadn't really been exposed to the UFO subject at all. He wasn't entirely sure what was happening to him. It was very confusing. He wasn't really even thinking extraterrestrial, certainly not at the time. In hindsight, of course, it was very obvious to him that these were what we call gray-type extraterrestrials, and that they were examining him. And this is what most people will describe when being taken on board a UFO. It's one of the most common experiences that people have during an onboard UFO encounter. And this was exactly what was happening to him. And this was more than just an exam. It was clear to him that the ETs were doing something to him. So as Richard lay on the table, he realized that he had no clothes on. He couldn't move. Although his body was shaking involuntarily, he thinks both from fear and the cold. He said he could detect an odor sort of like an old fish tank. A bright light was shining down on him from above. His heart was pounding. He could only move his eyes, and looking to his left, he saw a short figure. What he later learned were, of course, typical gray ETs, bald, gray skin with very large dark eyes. Looking towards the foot of the table, he saw, standing about 15 feet away, a 7-foot tall figure, very tall, very much like the short ones, with large almond-shaped eyes, gray skin, long arms and legs, and it was staring directly at him. He could now see the walls of the room, which he said looked kind of like crinkled aluminum foil. He tried to cry out, but couldn't make a sound, and his fear increased as he gradually realized that this wasn't a dream. This was happening to him. He was totally awake. Tears started streaming from his eyes, down the sides of his head. Movement to his left caught his eye, and he could now see 3 little figures gliding quickly from a dark room beyond an arched doorway, and they surrounded the table Richard was on. There were 2 to his right, 1 to his left. They were each about, he estimates, 3.5 feet tall, again with the large hairless heads and big dark eyes. He said they showed no apparent emotion, moved very quickly as if they had a job to do. But with them was another identical-looking figure, except he was about 5 feet tall, with a more grayish-pink skin and a rough complexion. So the 7-foot-tall figure standing by the wall towards the foot of the bed seemed to be the one in charge. That was Richard's impression, and it continued to stare at him. At one point it tilted its head and smiled at him as if to say, "Don't worry, we're going to take care of you. It will be okay." At this point the little one crowded around the table and seemed to be focusing on Richard's stomach area, and he started to feel a strange tugging sensation there. The light coming from above shone down directly on his abdomen, and he again became consumed with fear. He didn't know who these people were. What were they doing to his stomach? Were they planning on eating him? All of these thoughts were running through his head. He was quite frightened, and this is when he heard a woman screaming. This sound came from his right, where he could just barely see a doorway leading to another room, and peering as best as he could in that direction, he could see an adult woman lying on a table. The table had a slight incline. He saw her legs kicking up and down as though she was struggling and fighting, and he heard her screaming out, cursing, and saying, "Don't you hurt him. He's just a boy. You hurt him, I'll kill every one of you." And she just kept cursing and protesting. This did provide Richard some relief, some comfort. He thought to himself, well, there's someone else here, an adult, someone who can protect him from what's going on. At this point, the tall one tilted his head at the smaller grays, sort of pointing to the other room, and these little short grays immediately went to attend to this screaming woman. The screaming stopped shortly later, and the short gray beings returned to Richard's table and continued to work on his stomach. Now the medium-sized gray walked around observing the smaller ones, while the tall one continued to stay at the foot of the table near the wall, near what looked like Richard to some sort of control panel. Richard now heard himself whimpering softly, and the medium-sized gray walked up to Richard's side, gazed directly into his eyes. He then laid his hand gently on Richard's head and said, telepathically, "What's the matter, child?" It was a gentle, calming male voice. Richard could hear it echoing inside his head rather than in his ears. And this being asked him again, "What's the matter, child?" Richard now found that he could speak, and he said, I'm cold, and I want to go home." He did now feel slightly more relaxed and calm because of this figure, who he felt was nurturing. And this gray said, "Well, we're going to check on something, and then you can go home." The gray then stepped back and began to walk around the table, looking at what the smaller grays were doing. He did look briefly back into Richard's eyes, but then focused again on his stomach area. And then he stepped away, and immediately, once again, fear swept through Richard. His body began to shake violently from the fear and the cold, at which point the medium-sized gray again approached Richard, this time leaning down and bringing his face right down next to Richard's and staring directly into his eyes, only a few inches away, almost touching. This gave Richard a very close-up view. Richard could now vividly see the gray's liquidy black eyes. He could see what looked to him like a slimy fluid pooling at the bottom of the being's eyelids. And for some reason, this kind of repulsed him, perhaps because it confirmed that this was in fact a living creature. So he was a little bit disgusted by this. He tried unsuccessfully to move his head and look away, but this being continued to stare, then tilted its head slightly to the left and right. This puzzled Richard. He thought, why is he doing this? At this point, the being stood up and asked again, "What's wrong, child?" And Richard, again, finding that he could talk, I think it's telepathic at this point, but he said, "I'm cold, and I want to go home." Again, Richard's fear lessened as he felt this strong compassion coming from this gray being. As Richard says, he seemed to be concerned how I was feeling. He would check up on me, looking in my eyes, I guess for signs of stress. He just kept looking in my eyes from time to time, and then he would look at what they were doing. I felt very comfortable around him. Even though he made me comfortable, I was still shaking. I was scared. I was cold. But he tried his best to keep me calm and show that he was concerned and make sure I was okay. So despite this, fear once again filled him. These beings were clearly not human. He had never heard of aliens except on TV, science fiction. He wondered again if they were planning on eating him. They were doing something to his stomach, but he didn't know what. He couldn't see it. He felt no pain, but again could feel this tugging sensation. He tried over and over again to move his body, but couldn't even lift a finger. This puzzled him, as he couldn't see anything holding him down. Once again, the tall being looked down at him, smiled in a very friendly way. Again, Richard heard himself whimpering, and for a third time, this 5-foot gray approached him and said, "What's wrong, child?" And Richard said, "I want to go home." At this point, the gray placed his hand gently on Richard's forehead and said, "We're almost done, and then you can go home." He said the voice was very soothing, and almost handsome sounding is how he put it. Richard again felt some of his fear leaving. He saw the gray's hand and noticed that the fingers were exceptionally long. They did not have fingernails, but definitely had ridges and pores like a living creature. At one point, the little ones looked up at the medium gray and seemed to nod. At this point, Richard felt a strange sleepiness sweep over him, and he passed out. He was unable to remain awake. Darkness enveloped him. He closed his eyes and fell asleep. He estimates that the entire onboard experience lasted about 45 minutes, and his next memory was of waking up in bed. How incredible is that? Richard was able to remember everything. That's a pretty long experience, 45 minutes. And he remembered it in such great detail, even to the point of having conversations, although limited, with these apparent extraterrestrials. And what's so amazing about his case is, of course, that he got corroboration. He was not the only one taken on board. Along with him was his mother, who, of course, after visiting the hypnotist Retha Martin, also remembered everything in full detail. So she remembered as well. What she remembered, again, absolutely corroborated what Richard remembered. Going to see Retha Martin, Inus would never in a million years have expected to remember being taken on board a extraterrestrial craft. But as she went under hypnosis, the memories surfaced easily, without any prompting from the hypnotist. Inus remembered waking up, and to her shock, she discovered she was no longer in her bedroom, and instead she was lying on an inclined table in a small room with silvery gray colored walls, just exactly as her son had described. She struggled to get up and found she couldn't move. Looking to her side, she saw her son and a 5-foot-tall, bald-headed, gray-skinned creature standing next to another table, which had her 7-year-old son lying on it. He wasn't moving. She saw that one of the Greys had a small metal wand-like device in its hand and was holding it next to Richard's head. She saw the 3 shorter gray-skinned figures next to his table and one very tall one standing by the wall, exactly as Richard had recalled. The only real difference was to her that this tall figure appeared to be closer to 8 feet tall, while Richard remembered 7. She was more angry than frightened, and at this point, just as Richard had recalled, she let out a stream of curses, threatening to kill the aliens if they hurt her son. Immediately, one of the short beings walked up to her, turned his head, and looked directly into her eyes and said telepathically, "Don't worry, we're not going to hurt him." She said she couldn't tell whether or not the figures were wearing any clothes, but what she most remembered was her constant struggle to get up and telling the ETs over and over again that they better not hurt her son. And they just kept telling her not to worry, that he wouldn't be hurt, and that everything was fine. She could see that they were doing something to him, but she couldn't see what. And finally she just passed out. When she woke up, it was the next morning, and of course she had no memory of the encounter at all. Like Richard, it had been completely erased from her mind. Both she and Richard were amazed how perfectly their memories matched. There was no other explanation other than that this was a real event. They had both been taken together on board a UFO. But it was then that Inus's mind went back to when she had a strange experience, back when she was only 7 years old. It never made any sense to her at the time, but now, in hindsight, looking back, she realized that this was likely an alien encounter. At the time she was living in her parents' farmhouse in rural Kentucky. She had gone to the barn to collect the chicken eggs in the morning, and to her surprise she saw that a snake had gotten into the barn and was swallowing one of the eggs, and she was watching this when she had a sensation of being watched herself, and looking up, she got an incredible shock, because a strange being was looking at her, some kind of humanoid. This surprised her and frightened her so badly that she didn't really stop to take a look at it, and instead just took off running. And instead of going around the fence as she normally would have, she just hopped right over it and went straight into the house. But again, she never got a good look at this humanoid, so it was hard for her to describe it. She does say that following this encounter, she began having regular nightmares of this strange creature staring at her. So now, having remembered this other encounter, both she and Richard marveled at this coincidence, that both of them were 7 years old and both had this encounter. So how amazing is that? Multiple witness onboard UFO encounters are certainly not unheard of. There's many, many in the UFO literature, but overall, they're pretty uncommon. So it's an important case in that regard, important because their testimony matches in great detail. But even more interesting is the fact that Richard's encounter occurred at age 7, and turns out his mom had an encounter at age 7 as well. So this case is really, I think, significant. There's a lot of people out there having encounters, and it's not often that people get this kind of corroboration. But as with most contactees, these events are rarely a one-off. Most contactees have multiple incidents throughout their life, and that's certainly true with Richard. In fact, it wasn't long before more encounters occurred. Now that Richard had gone under hypnosis and remembered all this, he hoped it would relieve his insomnia, but it didn't. And in fact, in some ways, it became even worse. Retha warned him that he might be having more recall, some dreams and memories about what had happened. And that was true. In fact, he began having nightmares of being back on the craft, shaking in fear. So this was very difficult for him. But time, as it does, marched on. He finished school, he met the love of his life, got married, started a family, and he kind of put the experience of being taken on board a UFO with his mother in the back of his mind and tried not to dwell on it. Years passed, but the next big event that shook up both Richard and his wife involved their second daughter. She was 7 years old when she began suffering from a series of pretty serious nosebleeds. She came running into their bedroom one day with this very bad nosebleed, and after a few incidents of this, they decided that they needed to take her to the doctor. But before they did, they took her to an already scheduled dental appointment. During the dental appointment, they took the routine x-rays that they would normally take, and to their shock, these x-rays revealed a strange object in his daughter's sinus cavity. The dentist seemed strangely dismissive about it, but when Richard pressed him about it, he suggested visiting a doctor. This object was just maybe a half-inch long, but it looked like it had little wires attaching it to the tissues and was way the heck up there in her sinus. Because the dentist was saying, well, maybe she stuck something up her nose, but it clearly wasn't that. So, without any help from the dentist, they decided to take her to a doctor, and he examined the x-rays and also acted strangely casual about it, saying, it's probably nothing. And clearly it was something. The more Richard questioned him about it, the more uncooperative the doctor became. So this puzzled him. He couldn't understand why the doctors weren't taking this more seriously. So they decided to take her to a third doctor. They showed him an x-ray with this weird anomaly and asked the doctor, I want to know what this is. Now this time the response was different. The doctor became silent, solemn. He closed the door to his office, opened a drawer, and handed Richard what looked to him like a legal government document. And he told Richard, if you tell anybody I showed this to you, I'm going to deny it. Now Richard quickly read the document, and the doctors told him, just about all the doctors in the United States get these, I'm told. And reading this document, Richard could hardly believe his eyes. It looked official and legitimate, and in brief, it said that if any patient comes into their office and the doctor finds evidence of an implant, a foreign body, they are to report it to the government and not attempt to remove it, or they could lose their medical license, be fined, and possibly imprisoned. So Richard asked the doctor, are you telling me this is an alien implant? The doctor just shrugged and said, this is why doctors make excuses to not remove these. This is all I can explain to you. When she gets older, maybe she can find a way to deal with this. So Richard wanted a copy of the document, but of course the doctor took it away. So Richard didn't get a nice long look at it, just quickly scanned it, and he left this doctor's office in a state of stunned amazement. It appeared that the medical community actually knew about these implants and had procedures they were supposed to follow with orders not to remove them, and that failure to obey these orders could result in dire consequences. It was some months later, Richard was watching a show about gray aliens on the History Channel when his daughter came running in and pointed to an image of one of the grays on the television. And she said, Daddy, that is the thing that touched my nose. That thing there, that monster, he touched my nose. He made it bleed. So this was absolutely amazing to Richard. This stunned him because his mom had an experience at age 7. So did he. And now here was his 7-year-old daughter reporting the same exact thing. Researchers have long known that UFO contact is generational, But when Richard's 7-year-old daughter began having encounters, that added a whole new level of complication to what was happening with he and his family. So this was quite a bit to deal with. And I think most contactees go through this. It's one thing to have your own encounters. It's quite another when it starts happening to your children. And there's another thing about contactees. I think there's a lot of focus on just the extraterrestrial aspect of UFO encounters, but the truth is there's all kinds of high strangeness. There's quite a few researchers out there who sort of gloss over this, censor it, or edit it out people's accounts. I think that's a mistake, because the truth is high strangeness is a part of the UFO contact experience. People often have a wide variety of psychic and paranormal events of all kinds happening to them. And that's certainly true for Richard. And for him, most of this high strangeness involved premonitions, these sort of precognition that kept happening to a degree that made it very difficult for him to deal with. So yeah, for him, the premonitions were a big part of all of this. Throughout his life, from an early age onward, Richard experienced premonitions of future events. These visions occurred spontaneously, without warning. For example, one day he had a sudden vision that his sister was going to win a tidy sum of money in the lottery. He told his mother, also wrote it down. Of course, a short time later, his sister came over and announced that she had won $500 on a lottery ticket. On another occasion, he had a vision that his sister had gotten in a bad argument with a friend. Shortly later, sure enough, his sister called and began to speak about this disagreement she and her friend had just had. So Richard began to make a point to tell people before the event or write it down in a sealed envelope so that he could prove this to other people, to the skeptics. Once, he told his sister that a friend would get in an auto accident involving the red car. Later that day, the friend called Richard's sister to report this accident. So Richard says these events happen on the average of 1 or 2 a month, though sometimes months would go by without one, and other times Richard would have a whole series of these visions. On one occasion, he saw his son getting into an accident when his water bottle slipped from between his legs and became lodged under the brake pedal. He asked if his son ever drove with a bottle between his legs, and his son said, "Yeah, I do that all the time." He told his son, "Don't do that." But shortly later, this accident happened, exactly as he had seen in his vision. On another occasion, he had a vision of his daughter, as an adult, being crushed by a vehicle balancing on a jack. Knowing that his daughter worked on cars, he warned her not to work on the car today. Don't get under any cars. A few hours later, she called him crying on the phone, saying that his warning had come just in time to save her life. The car she was working on fell off the jack, but remembering her father's warning, she got out from under the car before this happened. Nobody got hurt, thankfully. But these premonitions have been a big part of Richard's life, and he finds it quite hard to deal with. So this aspect of UFO encounters, I don't think can be underestimated or overlooked or emphasized enough. This is actually more the rule than the exception. There's something about the UFO contact experience that wakes people up to a wide variety of psychic abilities and can also spark a wide range of paranormal events. So we see a lot of contactees suddenly developing all kinds of psychic abilities, such as, in Richard's case, precognition, but all kinds of stuff: clairvoyance, astral projection, remote viewing, mediumship, healing abilities. The list goes on and on. I know for a fact that some researchers and authors on this subject have edited out these high strangeness aspects. I think that's a huge mistake. I think these are integral parts of the UFO contact experience and should not be overlooked or edited out, because this is absolutely part of the contact experience. And as you can see, it's a big part in Richard's case. And I will say that, of course, as we know, a UFO contact experience affects people on multiple levels. Emotionally, certainly, but spiritually, giving people a whole new outlook, psychically, waking them up to these incredible abilities. but also physically. And as time marched on, Richard developed a condition with his stomach, which basically necessitated an emergency visit to the doctor. And to his surprise, there was something going on with him that he thinks might be connected to his childhood encounter decades earlier. In 2008, Richard noticed an odd pain in his stomach. When it became worse, he decided to be safe and go to his doctor. They first suspected that it might be muscle pain or perhaps indigestion. They offered him medication, which he took. However, the pain did not go away and instead became worse. Richard returned to the doctor twice more and explained that this pain was becoming excruciating, and still the doctors were unable to figure out what was wrong. So 3 days after the last doctor's visit, his wife was preparing to take the kids to school. Richard took a sip of coffee in the kitchen, and suddenly he felt like somebody had punched him in the gut. He fell to the floor, writhing in agonizing pain, gasped out to his wife, "Call the ambulance," and he was taken by ambulance to the hospital. Doctors, of course, ordered x-rays and tests, and the diagnosis came quickly. Richard, they said, had a massive tumor in his stomach area. He had to have immediate surgery. They said this tumor was actually twisted up around his intestines. Thankfully, the surgery was successful. Tests showed that it was a benign tumor, but it really surprised the surgeon. He told Richard that this was the largest tumor he had ever removed in the course of his career, and judging by its size, shape, and the pattern of its growth, it must have been present in Richard's abdomen for a very long time, down to when he was a little kid. So this shocked Richard, and he instantly thought back to his UFO experience at age 7, when the Greys had seemed very interested in his stomach area. And he wondered, had they detected this tumor all those years ago? Was that what they were looking at? Had they prevented it from being cancerous? He doesn't know, but he thinks that this might have been actually a healing encounter, and that was the reason he was taken on board. As he says, "I don't think they were out to do something. I think if anything, who knows, they may have saved my life." That made sense to me. But here's the other big question. Why? Why are they concerned to keep me alive all these years? I don't know, so that remains a mystery. It was about a decade later that Richard started having some heart troubles, had to have chest x-rays, and when Richard filled out the information sheet, he wrote that he had been a heavy cigarette smoker since he was a teenager. And the doctor looked at him with complete disbelief, said that that can't be true, and explained that the x-rays of his lungs showed no evidence of someone that had been smoking for nearly 27 years. So the doctor asked him, "Do you inhale?" And Richard, of course, said yes. Richard's doctor shook his head in frank disbelief and told him, "That's impossible. Your lungs should show some kind of graying, but your x-rays show healthy, clean lungs." Richard insisted, "Well, I do inhale. Do you want to go outside and have one with me? I will show you." So the doctor was baffled, and so was Richard. And considering his ET encounters, he wondered if maybe they had something to do with the fact that his lungs showed no evidence of him being a smoker. So that whole ordeal is a bit of a mystery to Richard. It's very hard to speculate and know for sure if there's a connection or a correlation there. But he certainly has considered this possibility because, as the doctor said, this tumor was there probably since early childhood. And he thinks, again, perhaps that's what the ETs were working on when he was such a young boy, age 7. Now, Richard had never seen a UFO throughout all of this, other than that one experience at Lake Erie, which is unusual. Most contactees have quite a few sightings. Of course, he did see a UFO from the inside. But yeah, that Lake Erie sighting was his only sighting. But certainly wasn't his last, because as time moved forward, he, and in fact his entire family, had a very dramatic encounter while driving along a freeway at night in Cleveland, Ohio. One evening in 2018, Richard and his family were driving northeast of Cleveland along the highway. In the car were his 2 daughters, his son-in-law Scott, who was driving, his young 3-year-old granddaughter, Now his son-in-law was driving, Richard sat in the front passenger seat, and Richard noticed it first, this piercingly bright light very low on the horizon ahead of them. And as Richard says, I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, what is it? It's awfully bright. I've never seen anything like that before. So he's sitting in the car studying this when his daughter taps him on the shoulder and whispers, Dad, do you see that light? What is that? And he told her, I'm wondering the same thing. So he described this object as being piercingly bright, almost like a welder's arc. Suddenly it moved towards them and was directly over the highway, no more than 100 feet overhead. And it was a traffic-filled highway. This busy highway suddenly became filled with red brake lights as everyone slowed down to watch. And Richard described this object, though it was hard to tell its shape. It looked kind of triangular to him. It was too bright to really make out. But they could see that it was huge. He said it looked about 3 stories high. It had curved edges and what looked like evenly spaced panels along the perimeter. The bottom had a bright white light at each corner, a bright amber light in the middle. Behind that there was a smaller red light. Traffic came to a crawl as everyone was peering upwards and staring at this thing in shock. He could see other drivers pulling out their cell phones to try and take pictures or video. In fact, Richard himself was scrambling to get a phone to take a picture when his youngest daughter, the one who had seen the gray in her bedroom as a child at age 7, started screaming. She was terrified. She said, "Take us home. I don't want to see it. Take us home now." In fact, she tried to crawl under the seat. So she was terrified. At this point, the craft dimmed its lights. It tilted, leveled out, and darted upwards at super high speed. In just seconds, it became a little dot in the sky and was gone. It became clear to all of them that they had seen a genuine UFO. So this was really a dramatic sighting for all of them. And it wasn't long after this that his youngest daughter and her husband moved to Georgia. And one day they called Richard to say that they had started seeing UFOs directly over their property. It was weird because they'd see this strange light on the horizon, would approach at low altitude, dart around, hovering right overhead, and then take off at high speed. And this happened several times. By this point, Richard had done enough research to know that contact was generational. In fact, he wrote to Whitley Strieber, author of Communion and himself an experiencer, and he wrote back and explained about how contact is in fact generational. At one point, he considered writing Dr. Roger Lear about his daughter's possible implant. Unfortunately, he learned that Dr. Lear had passed away, so that never came to fruition. So we're starting to see a real pattern of events here, how contact can affect a person on so many different levels in so many different ways. Having sightings, missing time, onboard experiences, psychic events. There's a lot that's going on here. And of course, there's another aspect that gets a lot of attention and is not fully understood. Often contactees will wake up with marks on their body, marks that they don't know how got there. And that's certainly true in Richard's case, not only with Richard, but his wife. So when that started happening, they absolutely connected it to their UFO experiences because it kept happening. It was always one thing after another. One strange event would occur, things would calm down, and soon there would be another mystery. One evening in the summer of 2020, Richard and his wife, although it was still somewhat early, they climbed upstairs, stumbled into bed, and both instantly fell into a deep, restful sleep. This was very unusual. They don't go to bed that early. And Richard, of course, had a lot of trouble sleeping still. And both of them usually woke up a couple of times of the night to get a drink of water and go to the bathroom. But on this night, they not only went to bed early, they both slept the whole night through without waking up. So this was very unusual. It was around 6 a.m. Richard bolted awake, and he had the immediate sense that someone had been in the room. In fact, he had brief flashbacks of some figure in his room. He immediately saw that objects on the dresser had been knocked over. He felt strangely dazed, slightly disoriented. His wife woke up shortly later, and she also seemed numb and quiet and disoriented. and they talked about this. Both felt like they had been somewhere in the middle of the night, but neither could remember where. So had something happened that night? They couldn't be sure, but they think something probably did. And it wasn't long after this that they started to wake up with strange marks and bruises on their body. For example, one morning Richard noticed what looked kind of like a scoop mark on the back of his heel. He really didn't think much of it until his wife noticed it too and said, "It looks like you had a procedure done behind your heel." And he said, "Yeah, it does." Wasn't long after that she woke up with 3 perfectly round bruises and an equilateral triangle on her leg. Both were puzzled by its obvious uniformity and how fast these marks disappeared, healing overnight. They were even more puzzled when it happened again 4 days later, and she told him, "I swear, I don't know where I'm getting these." Soon Richard noticed a few other unexplained bruises, one on the inner thigh of his left leg, another on his arm by the elbow, and as he says, "We were getting these bruises and we didn't know where they're coming from." I do think these marks are connected to UFO experiences that are probably shrouded in amnesia and missing time. I can't say for sure, but it's a pretty common sign, if you will, of UFO contact and an experience that is perhaps, again, not fully remembered. And what's interesting in Richard's case is these were not the only little bits of evidence pointing towards contact. There were a couple of really interesting bits of evidence that he couldn't explain easily, including what appeared to be fingerprints that they didn't put on the window or the mirror in his case. And in one of these cases, it's connected directly to a very dramatic UFO encounter. This is also very odd. In 2021, Richard's mother Inus woke up in her multi-story apartment to a strange mystery. She saw 3 distinct fingerprints on her window pane. The problem was the fingerprints were on the inside of a sealed double-paned window. So it was impossible. And yet, of course, there they were. And she really didn't think too much of it until later that same day, a woman who lived in her building said that she was up really late the previous night and saw this UFO hovering right outside Inus's window. Now she lives on the 7th floor, and as the woman told Inus, "I didn't want to say anything and have people think I'm crazy." So Inus just shook her head and she thought to herself, that woman must have been seeing things. But then, remembering what had happened all those years ago, she wondered, could the ETs have come back? Now when Richard heard about this, he was very intrigued, because as he says, the mirror in our bedroom has the same 3 long finger smudges. He tried repeatedly to clean them off, but this mark remained for the longest time. Granted, things like this, marks on the body or fingerprints on a mirror or window, would be considered circumstantial evidence at best, hard to connect it directly to a UFO encounter. But when you have a UFO encounter happen right outside your window, next day there's fingerprints inside the double-paned window, that's hard to explain away, and I think certainly does seem to be connected. But as any contactee knows, this is something they learn to live with. It's just event after event after event. And one of the most interesting things, I think, about Richard's case is the fact that his mother had contact at age 7. He had contact at age 7. So did his daughter. But events were still in progress. Researchers, again, have long known that contact is generational. And Richard had long accepted that fact in his family. But events were still in progress, and things were taken to a whole new level when he found out that his granddaughter apparently was also having experiences. In 2020, Richard received startling news that sent his mind reeling. His daughter called from Georgia with information about his young granddaughter, age 7, and she told him, "You're not going to believe what she told me." Richard asked, "Well, what's that?" And she replied, "I'll let you talk to her yourself." So she was only 7 years old, came on the phone and said, "Pop, Mama said you could tell me that there's nothing to be afraid of this thing coming and standing outside of my window." Richard asked, "What thing?" And she replied, "It looks like a bald-headed monkey. It stands outside my window." Richard was shocked. He instantly thought of his mother's experience of seeing a strange figure at the same age, of his own experience and his daughter's. So it was now apparently happening to his granddaughter. And he asked her, "What happened?" And she replied, "It stands outside my window. I think one time it was in my room." Richard asked her, "Do you think it was a dream?" And she replied, "I don't know." So his daughter, the mother of the granddaughter, came back on the phone, and she asked Richard if he thought it might be the ETs coming back again. And he said, "I don't know. Just keep an eye on things. Let me know if anything else happens." But it was clear to him that what Whitley Strieber had told him was true. UFO contact was generational. So there's 4 generations here of contact. So this news did cause him concern, but ultimately Richard does not feel that the ETs are going to harm him or his family. He does have questions about what it all means to have contact with them, but he does not view this as a negative experience. So how about that? 4 generations of contact. Again, researchers have long learned that contact is generational. For some reason, ETs seem to be very interested in certain family genetic lines. The reasons are not fully understood, but again, these are people who are often very psychic. That's certainly a pattern. I think they're really just interested in upholding the genetics of humanity. And this is why we see so many cases of ETs collecting plants, animals of all kinds, and certainly human genetics. I don't see anything nefarious in this. And certainly Richard feels that his encounters, while certainly traumatic, especially early on, are benevolent in nature. He doesn't think the ETs are here to hurt, harm, or take over, and neither do I. I think it's very important to take an objective look at what is actually happening to people who have contact. It's one of the reasons I like Richard's case. He's very lucid. He's very detail-oriented on what has happened to him. And like most contactees, this is something he's learned to live with. High strangeness becomes a normal part of their lives. And again, that's absolutely true in Richard's case. The high strangeness continued. More sightings, more unusual events. Again, high strangeness became a part of his life. One evening in May of 2021, Richard was sitting outside on the front porch swing. He kept getting this impulse to look up in the sky. Finally he did, and this is when he saw a strange glowing object darting in and out of the clouds. He said it was quite high up, but he managed to snap a few images of it on his cell phone. And after putting the images through a filter, he could see that this object was in fact saucer-shaped. It was a few months later, July 4th, 2021, the family came over for a cookout. Richard and his mother sat on the porch while the others were inside filling their plates with food, when once again Richard had a feeling to look up. Instantly, both he and his mother saw what they described as a sort of tic-tac shaped object at very low elevation. As Richard says, "It flew over the back area of our house, maybe 200 feet up in the air and traveling very slowly. I know it was not a plane. It was perfectly oval, solid white, quiet, no wings, and no tail rudder." He said it moved off, traveling northeast into the distance, but they were both in awe. As Richard said, "I was so angry that I left my phone upstairs." Other weird stuff happened. More recently in 2023, Richard says he woke up with a terrible pain in his right leg. Looking down, he saw a bruise on his calf. The pain was bad enough that he went to the ER, who performed an MRI, and the diagnosis came that his bone had a fracture. So this really puzzled both he and the doctor. The doctor said it looked like the result of blunt force trauma, but as Richard says, "I swear to all that's good, I don't know how this happened." So this happened overnight while he was sleeping. It's a mystery. Richard also reports what might be telepathic communication from the ETs. One evening, he was listening to me talk on the radio about his case. This book had already come out. And he says he heard, quote, "something in my head." And it told him, quote, "You did good. This will help like the others." So Richard's not exactly sure what that means, but it sounds positive, and he felt it was important enough to share. In late 2023, he was getting ready for bed when, as he says, quote, something in my head said go outside. So he did, and he was amazed to see this object flying up near the location of the moon. This was followed by another, and then another, until he saw a total of 6 objects. As Richard says, and I quote, they began moving around each other, and then a few would stop. And the ones that hadn't stopped began dancing around the one that were stopped. Then a very bright red one came from the northwest, and as it moved slowly towards the southeast and heading towards one of the white bright ones, I was thinking that red one is going to collide with the white one. Then the white one moved off to the side, let the red one continue on its path. I was looking at them in awe, and I got excited and mad that I didn't have my cell phone with me. So at this point, he decided to go get Jen and his phone. He wanted his wife to see this. He could see these objects just hanging there, and he's like, oh my God, how could nobody else be seeing this? He said it was like this incredible light show. He said, and I quote, it's like they were saying, see, we're still with you. We're still around. Now, interestingly, he says the next day, 2 problems he was having with a current model project came into his mind, and he wondered if the sighting the previous night had something to do with him suddenly having the solution to his problem. The latest event happened in 2024, he said. He and his friend went to Lake Erie to see the northern lights, and instead saw a crescent-shaped object low to the water, which then began to change into a spherical shape. Really impressed his friend, who was very skeptical. That night, they both had dreams about UFOs and ETs, and Richard once again woke up with an unexplained bruise on his body. Most recently, they've just moved into a new home. His granddaughters came to visit and came running inside to say that they saw a UFO. Richard went out, and he saw it too. The very latest weird event just occurred. He started hearing this unexplained tapping sound on his wall. This has occurred several times. This is kind of like poltergeist-like activity. Very strange. So there you go. That's the true story of Inus and Richard Simon and their family's encounters with UFOs. His shared experience with his mother is such an amazing onboard encounter. Really want to thank you, Richard and Inus, for sharing your story with me. I think it will help a lot of people. So many people out there are having contact. I know a lot of you guys who are watching this have had your own experiences, and I think each case adds to our knowledge of what's going on here. I feel like this is a really important subject. Humanity deserves to know the truth about it. Sooner or later, disclosure is going to happen. I think it's inevitable. I think what's also inevitable at some point is open official contact. I mean, we'll see how this rolls out in humanity's future. But this is certainly a fascinating subject, which has so much to teach us, not only about what is out there beyond Earth, but about ourselves and our own abilities and our own connection to extraterrestrials. I do think that's what we're dealing with here. Extraterrestrials in the classic sense, people, biological beings living on other planets, people very much like us. And I will say that most researchers who look into this come away with the same theory. And when I say researchers, people who focus mostly on onboard experiences. And I think that's true for most contactees as well. So yeah, a wonderful case. Thank you again, Richard, for sharing it with me, and Inus, and all you guys in the family. So I mean, I just can't say enough. Thank you. Again, this story is told in my book, Humanoids in High Strangeness, 20 True UFO Encounters. It's quite a long chapter, chapter number 1. I had to shorten all the details for this video, otherwise it would have been 2 hours long easy. So if you want to hear the full story, certainly check that out. It is available not only on Kindle and print, but now in audio as well. One more quick note. For those of you who are searching for a list of the encounters on my YouTube channel, go to my website, www.prestondennett.weebly.com, and I've put a list up there of all the episodes with links so that it's easier to navigate. Just wanted to let you guys know that because this is a relatively new development. I worked really hard at it because now I've got quite a few episodes on this channel. So that's it for today. Thanks so much, you guys. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Hope perhaps you learned something. And most of all, keep asking those hard questions. I say it every week. It's up to you guys to find the truth of what's going on here. Don't believe me? Do your own research. I'm trying to just present all this stuff as objectively and as detailed as I can in a sort of facts-only reporting. So yeah, thanks very much. And until next time, keep having fun. And I will see you next Friday. Bye for now.